Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, May 1st, 2024. Aaron Maté joins us now. Aaron, thank you, my dear friend. Thank you for your time today. Speaking about time, you have just produced a dissertation. Well, it's about 20 or 25 pages long, which is available at Real Clear Investigations on what 10 years of U.S. meddling in Ukraine have wrought. An exhaustively researched, thoroughly presented, brilliantly articulated argument. And there's a spoiler alert in the title, but I'll let you deal with the spoiler alert. What have 10 years of U.S. meddling in Ukraine brought?
Well, according to Joe Biden, and really at this point, the bipartisan establishment, because House Speaker Mike Johnson just helped push through the $61 billion measure to prolong the proxy war that Joe Biden and his team began. Ukraine's on the front lines of democracy. That's been the talking point from Joe Biden, that if we don't help Ukraine, then democracy will lose. It'll be a victory for autocratic forces everywhere. What I point out in the piece is simply looking back at the actual record of the last 10 years. The U.S. role in Ukraine has undermined democracy, not only in Ukraine, but also in the U.S., because after being serving on the front lines of a really dangerous proxy war inside Ukraine, which has undermined Ukrainian democracy, starting with the overthrow of its government in February 2014, backed by the U.S., the Obama-Biden administration, Ukraine's also been used to meddle in U.S. politics in really consequential ways, factoring heavily in the 2016 campaign, in the first impeachment of Donald Trump, and then even in 2020 as well. And it probably stands to factor in 2024 campaign too. And I go through just some of the key details in all this, and it is a very, very long piece. But I have some extraordinary revelations, or I think some important revelations, which I can talk about, that come from a Ukrainian insider who's seen all of this from the start, named Andrei Telechenko, who took part in the Maidan movement back when it began in late 2013. And then worked for the Ukrainian government after the coup that the U.S. backed, and then worked for Blue Star Strategies, which is a Democratic Party-tied firm that worked with Burisma, which of course is the energy company that hired Hunter Biden right after his father, Joe Biden, helped overthrow the government in Ukraine. So there's a whole lot to go through. But what I argue here is that rather than portraying Ukraine as being on the front lines of a democratic struggle, as is the standard narrative in the U.S., Ukraine's been used to undermine democracy in both countries, both in Washington and in Kyiv.
Give us the backstory, if you would. I know there's a tremendous amount of detail here, and some of the names are quite familiar to us. Vice President Biden, of course, CIA Director Brennan, Victoria Nuland, Barack Obama resisting the efforts of the neocons around him to provide the type of weaponry and military support that Joe Biden has. But give us the thumbnail sketch starting in 2013, I guess.
Well, the experience of Obama really underscores a very common theme here, which is that it doesn't really matter. I mean, the whole story of Ukraine underscores that in both countries, whatever the elected president wants ultimately doesn't really matter. You had Obama actually being pretty tepid about waging a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. He resisted efforts to arm Ukraine. He actually threw his support behind Angela Merkel as she negotiated the Minsk II Accords. But right as Merkel was doing that, there was a meeting on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in February 2015, right before the Minsk II Accords were signed. And the Minsk II was the deal that was supposed to end the war in the Donbass that began after the U.S. backed a coup in February 2014, this war between Russian-backed rebels in the east and the U.S.-backed post-coup government. So as Angela Merkel is negotiating a peace deal, Victoria Nuland is meeting with John McCain, Mike Pompeo, on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference at a luxury hotel. And she's saying, we're going to ignore the Minsk Accords, basically. She's saying this is an act of betrayal. John McCain is comparing Merkel to Chamberlain and saying all this is appeasement. And Nuland's saying we're going to keep flooding Ukraine with weapons no matter what happens with this peace deal.
What did the Minsk Accords, just for the benefit of our audience that may not be familiar with it, what did they do in a nutshell, and who were the agreeing parties?
So after you have the U.S. backing a coup in February 2014, and you asked me about that, so I'll go back to that in a second because I skipped over that part. But once there is that coup, you have a war breakout between Russian-backed Eastern Ukrainians who are opposed to this new government because they've not only overthrown their elected president Yanukovych, but also one of their first moves is to try to ban the Russian language. And so people in Eastern Ukraine see all this as an assault on their very existence. So they take up arms with Russia's support. There's, some fighting. Finally, in February 2015, you have the Minsk II Accords to end the fighting. And the basic bargain is these Eastern Ukrainians will get some limited autonomy, have their rights respected. They'll be able to speak Russian. There'll be no more attempts to ban their language. And they'll have some limited autonomy, the right to appoint their own judges and police forces, but they'll stay inside of Ukraine rather than separating. And in return, Russian forces that have gone there to aid them, will withdraw along with their heavy weaponry, and there will be peace. That's the basic bargain. But Nuland, meanwhile, is saying, we're not going to respect these Minsk Accords. And she sides in doing so with the ultra-nationalists of Ukraine, who also don't want the Minsk Accords because I don't think they want these Russian-aligned Eastern Ukrainians in their country. And certainly they don't want anything that can respect their existence, respect their culture, because they're so devoted to their conception of Ukrainian nationalism. And that's, by the way, the same faction that Victoria Nuland and her allies in the Obama administration got behind when in February 2014, a year earlier, after weeks of protests on the Maidan that get increasingly violent against Yanukovych, there's a power sharing agreement brokered by the EU in a very similar situation. And again, the ultranationalists said, we're not going to accept that. We're not going to accept leaving Yanukovych in power. And after Yanukovych's forces pulled back under their terms of the deal, the ultranationalists took advantage, stormed the parliament, pushed through a new government. And the U.S., even though they had welcomed that power sharing agreement brokered by the EU that would have left Yanukovych in power, they immediately forget all that and say, yes, this is great. We support the new government. So you have two incidents there, the coup of 2014 and the signing of the Minsk Accords, where you have a compromise reached, ultranationalists in Ukraine, backed by neocons in Washington, completely undermine it. In the case of the Minsk Accords, you have Victoria Nuland saying that she's going to undermine her own president, Barack Obama.
Wow, because Barack Obama, to his credit, did not want to be involved in supplying cash or military gear to whoever was running the government of Ukraine at the time. And that obviously was the people that Mrs. Nuland chose. What is the right sector and what is Svoboda? Did Mrs. Nuland have her, did she align the American foreign policy establishment with the most right-wing, dangerous aspects of the groups competing for power in Ukraine?
Yes, she did. 1 year before the Maidan protests break out, the European Parliament puts out a statement condemning Svoboda, this political party in Ukraine, calling them anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and saying that nobody should associate with them. That's the European Parliament's view. Fast forward 1 year later, Victoria Nuland takes a different view because Svoboda is a part of this hardline contingent in the Maidan movement that, whereas other people in the Maidan were protesting peacefully, rallying against corruption because Yanukovych was corrupt, and protesting his decision to delay a European association agreement because they were upset that they felt as if this would ruin their chances to align closely with the West. Svoboda is a part of a hardline faction that isn't just calling for closer ties with the West and protesting corruption. They want regime change. And when they're calling for regime change, they basically take advantage of the Maidan protests to push for that. And Nuland and John McCain and Chris Murphy show their support by going to Kyiv, and they walk around with and they appear with the leader of Svoboda. 1 year after the European Parliament says don't associate with these guys because they're anti-Semitic and they're extremist.
So John McCain and Chris Murphy, Senator Murphy from Connecticut, still senator. McCain, of course, has passed on. Were walking around Kyiv arm in arm with Nazis.
Yes, they were, and then you have that leaked phone call where Victoria Nuland is talking about who should be in the new Ukrainian leadership, and even though she's hanging around with the leaders of Svoboda, she's saying, you know what, it's not a good idea for them to go into government. It's not a good idea. They're better on the outside, and I think what she meant by that is it wouldn't look good to have fascists, neo-Nazis heading a new government. They're better on the outside where, they can use their muscle to basically push through whatever they want and what the U.S. wants. And that's why they settled on someone named Yatsenyuk, who was more of a technocrat, even though he also had endorsed violence. And a really interesting thing happens after the coup, which I have new details on in my article. So you have, after the coup, Russia seizes Crimea because they worry about this new coup government handing over their most important naval port to NATO.
Right.
Because that's where, and Crimea has historically been a part of the Russian sphere. It was until it was transferred to Ukraine in the 1950s in a very controversial decision. So Russia seizes Crimea, and then you have this uprising in the Donbass by Eastern Ukrainians who are worried about an assault on their culture and who oppose this new government. At the time, Putin, rather than saying, we're going to annex the Donbass as he did in Crimea, he actually says the Donbass should be a part of Ukraine, and there should be dialogue between the rebels and the new government. And in public, the Biden administration says the same thing, that we want dialogue, we want to resolve this peacefully. Well, in my article, I report that, in fact, behind the scenes, the U.S. was doing the exact opposite. And in mid-April 2014, John Brennan, who's then the head of the CIA, he goes to Kyiv for secret meetings with Ukrainian leaders. And it was supposed to be secret, but the Kremlin, which has a lot of informants inside Ukraine, outed Brennan's visit and said they accused Brennan of basically being there to encourage a Ukrainian assault on the Donbass, to basically start a new civil war inside the country. John Brennan denied this. He said, we're there for peace. I'm there just to talk to our partners. The Obama administration denied this. But I spoke to someone, Andrei Telechenko, who was serving as a Ukrainian official at the time, who was in the meeting with John Brennan, who was in the meeting with Brennan and, Ukrainian officials. Also there was Jeffrey. And Telechenko told me that Brennan, contrary to what he was saying publicly, encouraged a Ukrainian military assault on the Donbass, said that Russia was behind all of this. You had to show them that they can't do this, and we will support you in this. So in public, the Obama administration was saying we support dialogue. In private, according to Telechenko, who was in the meeting, Brennan was saying, go to war, we'll back you up. And
did President Obama know what Brennan and Nuland were doing?
That's a great question. That's a fantastic question. Right after, a week after that Brennan meeting, there was an article in the New York Times that basically said, it was sourced to White House officials, and it said, we're not going to deal with Putin anymore. Obama has decided there's no chance of a constructive relationship with him. We're not going to deal with him, and we're going to be tough with him. And what it basically was a declaration of a new Cold War, because what they were saying was there's no chance of any kind of diplomacy with Putin as long as he's in power. But then the article goes on to say that people inside the White House are frustrated with Obama because he's not being tough enough on Russia. So, which is interesting. Simultaneously, they're saying that Obama's decided that he's not going to deal with Putin anymore. But then they're also saying that people inside the White House are mad at Obama because he's not being tough enough with Putin. So which is it? What I think that was officials in the White House, specifically Victoria Nuland, saying, trying to basically lock Obama into a Cold War without him even knowing it, without him even saying it, to basically build up public pressure so that he'd be locked into this proxy war with Russia, whether he wanted it or not. Because they're complaining about how tepid he was. So personally, if Obama had his way, I don't think he would have done all this. But it shows who really has power in Washington. Because, as his own advisor, Derek Chollet, said, this was a rare case inside the White House where pretty much all of Obama's aides were against his policy. And ultimately, who won? It was them, because they ended up fueling this proxy war. John Brennan encouraged Ukraine to fight the Eastern Ukrainians. That led to a civil war in which 14,000 people were killed. And yes, Obama dragged his feet, but ultimately, Ukraine got the weapons. And when Trump took office, he was boxed in by Russiagate because he was being accused of being a Russian agent, which they used to basically get him to show his toughness on Russia by approving weapons that Obama wouldn't even send. So ultimately, yeah.
Go ahead.
So ultimately, from both Obama to Trump, whatever they personally wanted, it didn't matter because the neocons won.
Did the Ukrainian intelligence community endeavor to help Mrs. Clinton in the race against Donald Trump in 2016?
Yes, they did. And amazingly, even though that race is now 8 years ago, we're still only learning critical details about it. First of all, if you read corporate media now, it's just an article of faith that if you say that Ukraine interfered in 2016 on behalf of Clinton, that's a conspiracy theory. The Washington Post recently called that a smear spread by Russian intelligence. It's not a smear. Ukrainian officials openly admitted at the time that they were trying to help Clinton. There's an article about it in the Financial Times where Ukrainian officials were openly saying, we are trying to help Clinton. And one of the ways they did that was by leaking a apparently fake ledger showing secret cash payments to Paul Manafort, who was then Trump's campaign manager, by Yanukovych's party. And the release of that so-called secret ledger prompted Manafort's resignation, even though Manafort denied any wrongdoing. But that was in the early stages of the collusion hoax by the Clinton campaign. And I think at that time, Trump didn't realize what was fully going on, and he didn't want the distraction of Paul Manafort and his business affairs. So Manafort resigned, and that likely came from a fake ledger that was the result of Ukraine trying to produce dirt against the Trump campaign, as they openly stated they wanted to do, right? So you have that. You have Ukraine openly meddling there. Now we only recently learned, 8 years later, that when it comes to the other main Russiagate allegation, so you have collusion, right? That was one plank of the Russiagate scam. The other major plank of it was that Russia stole Democratic Party emails to help Trump. And now we learn 8 years later, and buried in that recent article in the New York Times, which disclosed that there were 12 CIA bases inside Ukraine. In that same article, the CIA also discloses, oh yeah, by the way, that claim that Russia stole Democratic Party emails, we got a lot of that from Ukrainian intelligence. So Ukrainian intelligence, now we learn, played a major role in fingering Russia for the DNC hack. And, now we're a bit removed from all that, but for people who recall that period, this was the issue that dominated U.S. politics for years.
Right.
Russia's alleged DNC email theft was deemed to be an act of war. That's why we couldn't get along with Russia, and that's why Trump was possibly a Russian agent, because Russia had interfered on his behalf. And now we learned that the same government that the U.S. helped install, that the U.S. basically controlled because the CIA played a major role in running Ukrainian intelligence, that same government played a critical role not only in helping the collusion angle of the Russiagate scam by leaking the Manafort ledger, but also by generating the foundational allegation which started Russiagate, that Russia stole the emails. And we're only getting this 8 years later. And by the way, what happened when Trump tried to ask Zelensky about that?
He got impeached.
He got impeached because if you look at that phone call, between him and Zelensky, which is held right after Robert Mueller had that terrible congressional appearance, and Democrats are desperate to rebound from the failure of their Russiagate conspiracy theories. On that phone call, it's widely thought that Trump mainly wanted Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. No, the first thing he wants Zelensky's help with is not the Bidens. It's investigating Ukraine's role in the origins of Russiagate. So when he went there, he got impeached. So that's another example of also you cannot question the national security state and how Ukraine has been used to constantly interfere in U.S. politics after we interfered in their country to begin with.